Dear friends of the General Anthroposophical Section of the Anthroposophical Studies at the Goetheanum. Today's lecture, as you know, is entitled Rudolf Steiner Reads Aristotle. And it is part of a series of lectures of the General Section that is entitled Rudolf Steiner Reads, in which we explore the Steiner as a reader, as a student of the philosophical tradition of different individualities of the history of philosophy. It started already last year, and today it's the turn of Aristotle. Later this year, on the 9th of July, Professor Salvatore Lavecchia will speak of Steiner Reads Plato. That will be his lecture. And on December, Professor Petazelk will give a lecture entitled Steiner Reads Thomas Aquinas. And this series of lectures will continue on next year. And we will visit different thinkers like Hegel, Schelling, and others. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, well, today's lecture will have three main parts. The first one, very short part, in which I will talk a little bit about the actual books of Aristotle that one finds in Steiner's personal library. The second part is divided itself in two little parts. The first one, I will give a general account of the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. And the second part then is that then we will go into the actual interpretation of Steiner about Aristotle, how Steiner conceived of Aristotle's philosophy, how he saw it, how he understood it. And the third and final part of the lecture I will dedicate to defend the claim that Steiner is an Aristotelian. And I will say more about that later on. So, to begin with, if one goes to Steiner's library, one will find pretty much the entire corpus of Aristotle's works. Basically, all the works that were published at the time. And he has different editions, some of the best editions in German of the 19th century. And curiously, I didn't find as many annotations and underlinings as I thought I might. I expected to find more. So most of the books are actually not very much handled in a way, which is remarkable. The three books, however, that bear a lot of indications are the posterior analytics that belong to the organon. The organon is the logical part of Aristotle's works. And that book is about the theory of knowledge of Aristotle. The other book, interestingly, that is very much used, underlined, notes, is the Poetics. And I didn't go too deep into it at all, but I think one could find a lot of valuable things there if one wanted to do some research, because I think I would expect to find many parallels, many indications regarding the mystery dramas, certain relations to the mystery dramas, or, for example, Steiner's interpretation of Goethe's Faust, among other things. But it certainly seems that Steiner read that book and studied it very deeply. And the other one that seems to have been used quite a bit is the Metaphysics, which is probably the most important theoretical work of Aristotle. But here there's not a lot of annotations and a lot of underlinings. However, one thing that Steiner used to do, as he traveled a lot, when a book was too big and he wanted to take it with him on his travels, he would just tear it apart. So he would just tear apart the book and take with him the parts that he would need. And of course, it was a mess at the end. But the people in the library have reconstituted the books, made copies of the loose leaves, and then one can look at the book and so on. And one can find in the metaphysics that he did look at it and made some little underlinings and exclamation marks and things of this nature, but not as much as I expected originally. And so here is my suspicion. My suspicion is that Steiner studied these books, many more of these that seem untouched in his library, before he acquired the books that ended up in his library when he crossed the threshold. So that it is, of course, this should be obvious, there's no indication about the extent to which he actually dealt with these contents. So the interesting thing for us is to look at what we do have anyway, right? And in this sense, it was interesting to look at the posterior analytics. Steiner underlined not just things that he found interesting, but rather he underlined the book in such a way that it showed that he was studying it. He wanted to study it deeply, and he did so. And there were some annotations, in particular with regards to Aristotle's notion of the intellectual capacity that we have to acquire an insight into first principles in a way that is not derived from syllogistic, logical processes that Aristotle explains in previous books. So I will not go into these things now, but there is definitely interesting things to be found there. And one thing that was also striking for me was that the Anima, the book on the soul of Aristotle, which has been perhaps one of the most commented and debated books in the history of philosophy, and around which we will see a little bit of that later, some of the perhaps most striking debates and even feuds in interpretation have been held, and Steiner's De Anima is barely touched. So I put that one. I think that Steiner really understood this book very deeply, studied it very deeply, but the book that he studied with didn't end up in his actual library as we have it now. And another, I'll just mention it, striking thing is that the physics is not there, which is also very strange because it's one, again, like the metaphysics, one of the main theoretical works of Aristotle. So it probably was lost somewhere. We don't know where. But yeah, so much about the actual physical reading of Aristotle. I will talk about Steiner's interpretation of Aristotle after I say a few words, or more than a few, about Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy. Yeah. So when one looks at Plato, one looks at Plato's work, I think that one finds there a soul, an initiate, really, an initiated individual whose impulse, whose striving is to, not so much to teach his fellow men, but to awaken something in his readers. He wants to affect the inner processes of consciousness that live potentially in his fellow men. It's not so much, it's obvious when one reads the dialogues, you don't find anywhere a set of doctrines that he's putting forth in any straightforward sense, but rather you find something quite different. And well, this is why also what Plato actually thought, still after 2,000 years, is still debated. But I think that is a good assessment of it. Plato really wanted his reader to think for himself or herself from within their own powers. And this is, I think, what he wanted to achieve. I think he would have said something like this. Our experience of the world, our experienced world, seems to be what it is, But the world is not what it seems to be. The things of the world, the perceptible objects, the values that I and my fellow men in my society hold dear, are not what they seem. They are merely attempts at being something they do not reach. Now, believing that we are in the world that it seems to be what it is doxa. It's opinion. Our souls seem to be, for Plato, trapped in a form of consciousness that does not permit us to realize the futility, the failure that the actual world really is when we experience it perceptually, when we experience it in our social opinions. And so what he is seeking is an experience in the reader that awakens a sense of failure with regards to one's own beliefs about the outer world. So he uses a method that is called the elenchus. It's also called the Socratic method, probably derived obviously from his master Socrates. And elenchus, which means refutation, but in the case of Plato, goes a little bit beyond that. He will do something like this. Through Socrates, he will have Socrates ask someone with whom he's speaking, what is justice, say? And of course, the person will say, will attempt at giving a definition of what justice is. That already is a strange situation. We usually presuppose that justice is whatever is just in my society. So I will answer in a way that mirrors exactly what I see justice to be. And Socrates, clever as he was very capable in showing the failure of that definition. And so the person that was speaking to Socrates would come into this experience of failure for once. And Socrates would press on and say, well, no, but you have given me a particular definition that applies here but doesn't apply there. I want justice as such, not the justice of Switzerland or of Athens. I want justice as such. That which allows me to recognize justice anywhere where there might be a particular form of justice. And people struggled to understand the question anyway and attempted a second definition. And then Socrates would say, well, what follows from that? This and this and that, all the way to a next point where it's again a failure to say what it is that we're asking for. And yet Socrates presses on. One more time, please give me what justice is. Until after the third or whatever number failures, the actual interlocutor of Socrates comes to this realization, this sense of failure, of ignorance, of I don't know. I actually don't know. I thought I did. I thought the world was what it seems to be. But the world doesn't seem to be what it seems to be. Now I know I don't know. That, for Plato, is progress. Because in the experience of failure, we have potentially the awareness of one's own ignorance. And in the awareness of one's own ignorance, we have cognitive openness for the first time. So now we're ready to open ourselves to know. But such an answer to what is justice is never given. Many dialogues of Plato end up in aporia, in contradiction, without an actual answer. But that is preferable, because now we have left doxa behind, and now we know what doxa is. And that is already some form of knowledge, some form of openness. So much for elenchus. That was definitely an aspect of Plato's work that I think is fundamental. But Plato definitely seems to have had a view on how these things really work. When you ask for what something is, you ask for what is it for this thing to be what it is. He called that eidos, or idea. the idea. No? So the way everybody has heard about the world of ideas of Plato. And these are not contingent. They necessarily are what they are. And they are eternal. They don't come to be and pass away. They don't change. Therefore, they are not physical or they're not in the sensible world at all. What we have in the sensible world are something like images or copies. Things that either participate or are copies of these ideas that live in the spiritual world, let's say, of which we don't have immediate access as long as we are trapped in our doxastic way of consciousness. So, this is where the experience of failure and the awareness of doxa leads to a chorismos, which means separation. The separation of the things themselves that really are what they are from the things that merely seem to be what they are but aren't. This separation between the eidos tulipness and the individual tulips, which is, this is a red tulip, and this is an orange tulip, and this is a yellow tulip, and so on. All of these do not end up being tulipness as such. They are attempts at being tulipness. They participate in tulipness, so to speak, in one way or another. How exactly, we don't know. But there is a separation. So Plato wants us to feel this separation, to become aware of it, through elenchus, through failure. And another thing he does is that he uses a lot of mythical and imaginary language. So he will talk about a cave. He will talk about a chariot of the soul that travels into the spiritual world and into the physical world, and so on. He will have the process of knowledge be, therefore, anamnesis, remembrance. Once we are aware of our merely opinionated view and our failure, we are open to remember what the soul which is akin to the ideas, experienced before incarnating in the physical world. Now, Plato was very aware of the logical difficulties of having this chorismos, this separation between the things that they are for themselves and the merely apparent things. And he actually expressed it in a dialogue, which is perhaps the hardest dialogue, maybe. It's called the Parmenides. And there we have this older philosopher, Parmenides, with his pupil, Zeno, talking to a young Socrates who is written by Plato as defending this idea of the world of eide forms as separated. And Zeno very skillfully shows this young Socrates how this separation leads to contradictions and failure themselves. So Plato was doing some sort of self-criticism of his own position. So just to illustrate that he was very aware of these things. He was not just believing this in a naive way, unaware of the difficulties that these brought about. Nevertheless, and to finish with Plato, he wanted to awaken the rational soul in others. I think that is his fundamental gesture. And he wanted others to think for themselves, truly, to awaken that within themselves. And this is how I see what lies behind all his attempts in his works, his beautiful works. Now, Aristotle. Aristotle was a pupil of Plato. He was in the academy for 20 years, give or take, and was a Platonist. He was a Platonist. And Aristotelian, this is one of the things that I want to express today. Aristotelianism is absolutely unintelligible if it is not Platonic to begin with. Aristotle was as genius as Plato. And well, after Plato's death, he leaves the academy behind and does many other things. He travels to other places, ends up becoming the teacher of Alexander the Great, comes back to Athens, creates his own school, the Lyceum, and eventually moves away from the original formulations, as we understand them, of Plato. And I want to characterize a little bit what that is, this moving away from Plato. In a way, one can see Aristotle as the culmination of ancient history of philosophy. The previous thinkers, Heraclitus, Thales, Anaximander, Anaxagoras, including Plato, were all somewhat connected to the mysteries, on the one hand, and on the other, they were attempting to do something new, which was to express, to put into words, the true ground of reality. And they had different candidates for that ground, whether it was fire or water or logos. This attempt at doing that comes to completion in Aristotle. In Aristotle, this comes to full clarity and transparency, and that can be found, I think, to begin with, in his categories, his work on terms and prepositions. And I will say a few things about that. So what Aristotle comes to say is to on legetai polakos, being can be said in many ways. This being is a new name for eidos in Plato. Being can be said in many ways. He realizes that there is a kinship between our capacity to speak and how that maps into actual reality. Reality finds expression in our language. And he said, well, with our language, we can do many things. We can express joy and sadness, and we can ask questions, and we can give orders. And we can also do something striking, which is to say things that can be either true or false. Not everything in language is either true or false. If I ask you to please close the door cannot be true or false. But if I say the tulip is red is a claim that can be conceived as true or false. And he called this aspect of language, which we now call propositional language, logos apophantikos, which means declarative speech. Actually, apophantikos means manifestation. But declarative speech, where we say how things are. And this is how things are being, what it is for something to be what it is. So when I say the tulip is red, I'm using the verb to be, is, in a way that manifests something, in this case, this tulip, as red. This tulip manifests its own being in a red way. This red way is one way in which we are, in which things are. And these ways of being, he called categories. Why? Because this he called the hypokimenon, which we now translate as the subject. Actually, hypokimenon is that which lies under, literally speaking. So he's inventing with this language. We're not talking about grammar. This is not grammar. This is something else. He's saying when we speak declaratively, we presuppose something of which we say something else. This, what we say, the redness in this case, is, he called it kategorumenon. Kategorumenon comes from the verb kategoreo, which means to accuse. For example, when I accuse someone of stealing my stuff and I go to the police and I say, I accuse someone of stealing my stuff. Yeah? So, in In declarative speech, we have something that we say of something that we're presupposing, underlying, unterlegen, hypokimenon, the subject. Now we say subject and predicate in grammatical forms, but that is not what it really is. This is previous to all these analysis of grammar. Yeah? But importantly, for Aristotle then, this being manifests itself in these different ways. And he called them categories, from kategorumenon, categories, such as quality, quantity, relation. This tulip is red. This tulip is 40 centimeters tall. This tulip is in the Goetheanum garden, and so on. And all those express ways in which things are. Now, why is this important? Because there is one category which is the most important and essential category. He called that ousia, which we call now substance. The substance, the ousia, is actually the eidos, is universal, like tulipness or like justice for itself. And that is universal, see, as in Plato. This is the most important category because it expresses the essential aspect of the being. So what it is for this, what is this? It is a tulip. The tulip expresses the universal tulipness, which makes this individual thing what it is. It is more essential than to say that it is red or that it's 40 centimeters tall. Yeah. Now, and this is the key point. Now I come to the key point. He distinguishes between primary substance and secondary substance. Secondary substance is always universal, general, and therefore is always a category. But there is a primary substance, a primary ousia, and this primary ousia can never be a category because it's never universal. It's completely individual. It is the presupposed thing, it's the hypokimenon, of which must be there in order to be able to say what things are at all. Any declarative speech presupposes a subject, a hypokimenon. This thing is entirely particular. So, this is the primary ousia, and this is the secondary ousia. This is this tulip, this is tulipness, and this is its quality, its quantity, and so on. These are all universals. This one is particular. However, this one also is universal. Because for this to be what it is, it must be tulip. The universal is inside the particular. Inwardly, it just is. And what he comes to express with this is that the universal does not exist separately. The universal exists just as appearing through material processes, making itself real, and yet at the same time it is also universal. So the particular and the universal are in this kind of unity, which is a tense unity, but that allows us to understand the main gesture of Aristotle. If anything is understood tonight, I hope that that is it. Aristotle understands how to recognize the universal in its realization, and therefore does away with the chorismos. The chorismos is broken because the tulipness is not separate anywhere. It's not in a different world, sending its race of being into individual tulips. No, the universal exists only insofar as it becomes the intrinsic forming force of individual things in the natural world. And so this unification, so to speak, of the universal and the particular also gives Aristotle some agility, let's say, that allows him to think of the natural world in a very sophisticated way. And he comes to conceptions that I'm sure many of you are aware of. The entelechy, for example. The entelechy which means in telos, from end, echin, which means to have. So enteleki means to have itself in the end. So a thing is fully what it is when it has managed to manifest itself through matter to the point where it becomes what it truly is. At that point, it has itself in its end. Previously, it was a movement of becoming up to the point where it fully manifests itself. Think of an embryo and a fully adult human being. The embryo is potentially the entelechy of the human being, but it's still potential. It is in a process of actualization, internally moving to show its own end, which is the manifestation of itself, to come into presence as a fully present and actual living universal in the particular. So, Aristotle sees reality as pervaded with these spiritual processes of activity. Every individual thing, every living thing, every soul is a process of manifestation of the spirit. It is activity. Matter is what allows for the universal to realize itself. But it realizes itself always in particulars. So activity, the activity of spirit. Now, how did Steiner view Aristotle? I would like to say a few things about this. It's quite remarkable. First, Steiner saw in Aristotle someone who was imbued with the knowledge of the mysteries, but in a way, in an unconscious way. He was not an initiate, like Plato was, for example. So Aristotle is a thinker who carries the knowledge of the mysteries, but not in a conscious way. In Aristotle, it turns into an intellectual capacity, and which maps itself into a conception of the world through mere intellectual powers. So I will read a quote from Steiner. This is from Gaia 61. He says, "When one studies Aristotle, one finds everywhere in him, in his logical, purely rational manner, something worked up and brought into ideas of which one must say Aristotle took it over from ancient times. There we find in him a thorough worldview that understands the universe, indeed all of nature, out of the furthest stellar spaces, as ensouled, as pervaded by spirit. What we see in the stars is for Aristotle not merely an accumulation of matter. In every star he sees simultaneously the expression, the material embodiment of a soul being. And the movement of a star through the universe is for Aristotle not the result of mere mechanical or physical forces, but the expression of the will of the star spirit or star soul." Close quote. So Aristotle is carrying this ancient knowledge, but an ancient knowledge that is not in an initiation form, but rather as remapped into an intellectual conception of the universe, where the spirit is retained as acting in nature. Another thing that is worth mentioning is that Aristotle could have been conceived as a naturalist, and it has been conceived as a naturalist, as someone who says there's only nature, and that's what it is. And we have to tune up our intellectual capacities to understand nature, and that's what it is. That's it. So many have seen in Aristotle a proto-empiricist of sorts. And Steiner rejects this view. Quote, And here Steiner quotes a famous claim attributed to Aristotle, where supposedly Aristotle says, "There is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses." And Steiner continues, says, "This sentence of Aristotle must not be interpreted in any kind of materialistic way, because Aristotle is far removed from any kind of materialistic worldview. This sentence is not to be taken in a worldview sense, but rather epistemologically. That is to say, Aristotle rejects the idea that one can gain knowledge about the world from within, but asserts that one can only gain knowledge by directing one's senses to the outside world, by receiving sensory impressions, and then using reason to form concepts from these sensory impressions. But of course, he does not deny that one receives spiritual things with the sensory impressions. He thinks of nature as permeated by spirit. Only, he thinks, one cannot arrive at the spiritual if one does not look out into nature." Here, I continue, this is still Steiner, "Here you can see the difference to the materialist. The materialist concludes there is only material outside, and one only forms concepts of the material. Aristotle thinks that all of nature is permeated by spirit, but the path of the human soul to reach the spirit is such that one must start from the sensory perception and process the sensory perception and process the sensory impressions into concepts. If Aristotle himself had been touched by an initiatory impulse, he would not have said that, for then he would not have known that if one frees oneself from sensory perception in the way we have described, one can attain knowledge of the spiritual world from within. So he did not want to deny the spiritual world, but only to show the path that human knowledge must take." Yeah, so we see already here appears Steiner differing from Aristotle in some way, but he's very keen on showing that we should never make of Aristotle an empiricist or a materialist in any way, shape, or form. That the worldview of Aristotle is deeply spiritual, only that it is through engaging intellectually with nature that we gain access to that spirit. Now, in Steiner was not an Aristotelian scholar, but he was very well aware of the debates of Aristotelian scholars in his time, and actually there was one between Franz Brentano and Edward Zeller being an Aristotelian scholar. Franz Brentano was as well. He was a philosopher and a psychologist in Vienna, a professor who actually, and very interestingly, was a teacher of Steiner, of Freud, of Meinong, of Husserl. It is even possible that Steiner, as a young man who attended the lectures of Franz Brentano in the university in Vienna, might have been in the same classroom with, for example, some like Edmund Husserl. This is a possibility we don't know, but it is definitely around that time. And Husserl, of course, then took a lot from Brentano and in creating the phenomenology, which would turn into a very important philosophical stream in the 20th century, but also influential on Steiner himself. So Brentano's Aristotelianism has been important for the 20th century, to say the least. And it's wonderful. I found a copy of the book by Brentano, one of the books by Brentano of Steiner in his library, and of which he says this. In Geas 175, he refers to this book, which I had in my hands. He says, Franz Brentano wrote a beautiful, splendid book in 1911 about Aristotle, in which he worked out those ideas and concepts that were particularly needed to be brought close to the present age. It is a remarkable karma of the times that this Franz Brentano wrote just now a comprehensive book about Aristotle, which everyone who values contact with a certain kind of thinking really must read. Close quote. What was the debate between Brentano and Zeller? This I'll just mention very quickly, but it is that debate that I spoke about regarding the anima, on the soul. So Aristotle has a famous passage on the book 3 of the Anima, chapter 5, in which he speaks about the intellect of the human being. And in it, Aristotle is extremely ambiguous, very difficult to interpret, where he speaks about the capacity of thinking, the intellect, the nous, as something that must be in some sense passive, to receive the forms, the eidos of things from sense perceptions, the form of the tulip. For me to be able to think what a tulip really is, I need to have in my intellect a receptive capacity of the form of the tulip. But in order for that to come about, there must be something like an activating principle in intellect. And this alone is separable and eternal, works like light, and is imperishable. So something must activate the intellect in the human soul so that the soul is able to cognize the world. But it is so ambiguous that we don't know if that active intellect just is God from the outside, by grace, so to speak, illuminating the souls of the human intellect, or if it is internal to the human being. If it is internal to the human being, this act is an act of the human being. And that is the only part of the soul that is separable and eternal, and so on. So the question of the belief in the immortality of the soul after death arises in interpreting Aristotle. Did he think that the soul survives death, that it carries on in a way, in a post-mortem soul experience? Or was this the external active intellect and the soul of the human being, so connected to its material process, just perishes? So this has been a matter of debate for thousands of years, and of course in the 19th century as well. And this is the debate between Brentano and Zeller. Zeller defends that the intellect is external, and that Aristotle didn't think that the human soul survives death. Whereas Brentano, connected much more to Thomas Aquinas, maybe we will hear more about that in December, this soul survives death. Now, Steiner sides very much with Brentano. Steiner thinks that Aristotle actually felt and believed and was striving to try to understand what the soul encounters when it dies. And that Aristotle did definitely think that we survive death only insofar as an intellect survives death, and that experience of the soul is one in which the soul plays for itself in conscious manner what it has done, good and bad, eternally, but it leads a kind of lesser experience. It is a world of shadows. A desire to come back to the world is intrinsically present for the soul, but it cannot. And it is a lesser form of existence because it cannot cognize the world any longer because it's not incarnated anymore. So that was the experience that Aristotle had, or the thoughts that Aristotle had with regards to the death of the individual soul, according to Steiner. So I'll quote here. Aristotle wanted to find in the soul what gives inner certainty that the soul is immortal. And there he experiences with complete clarity inner loneliness. Loneliness. With mystical experience, it is simply the case that one arrives at this loneliness. In this feeling of loneliness, one becomes completely clear that there is something within that extends beyond death. But that has no connection other than with my own I, which stands in no contact with the external world anymore. I cannot go further in grasping immortality. So, Aristotle says to himself. Yeah, that is in Gea 175. Yeah, close quote. Why could Aristotle see not further than that? Yeah, Steiner's interpretation of that is rather historical, more than critical. Aristotle's mission was precisely to develop the logical, rational instrument of human consciousness. And so to translate the ancient spiritual wisdom into the form of pure reason. And this mission required that the knowledge of reincarnation be dimmed in him. Yeah. So that is the point where anthroposophy goes beyond Aristotle, at least. Many others as well. But this is how Steiner criticizes, so to speak, Aristotle. It is a historical limit. Aristotle couldn't go further because of his own internal task, which he carried out. So, for the last section of today's lecture, I will try to defend the thesis, which is that Steiner is Aristotelian. Steiner is an Aristotelian. I mean, such a sentence can be understood or can be interpreted in at least 3 ways. Steiner is an Aristotelian might mean that Steiner believed the doctrinal aspects of Aristotle, that Steiner would repeat the same things Aristotle said about reality. This is not what I mean. A second way of interpreting it is a more analogical way, in which one may see Steiner as an Aristotelian in the sense that one can see aspects of Steiner's thought that correspond analogically somehow to some gestures in Aristotle, but not being quite the same. So it's a more comparative claim. That is also not what I want to say. A third one is a bit more generic, perhaps, but I think more adequate, and it's a more gestural interpretation of the sentence, where when I say that Steiner is an Aristotelian, I mean that the gesture that characterizes the thought of Aristotle, however generic that is for us at the moment, that characterizes also the thought of Steiner. Now, please don't get me wrong. There's many things in anthroposophy which do strike analogous relationships to Aristotle. And this is very fascinating. This is not what I'm going to defend now, but it's very a worthwhile attempt if one tries to do that. For example, one may see in the gradual conception of the soul in Aristotle, the nutritive soul, the sensitive soul, the intellectual soul, as bearing some kind of resemblance to the physical body, the etheric, the astral, and the dynamics of the soul, as described in anthroposophy. Another example would be, perhaps, the ethical doctrines of Aristotle, who insists that in order to be ethical, we need to find the mesotes, the midpoint between extremes that are possible for our souls. So, regarding a certain situation, you don't want to be foolhardy and be careless, but you also don't want to be a coward and let the fear paralyze you. Courage is this midpoint between foolhardiness and cowardness. And I mean, I think there is definitely some echo of that in the polarity of beings between Lucifer and Ahriman and their effects in our souls. But in any case, and I could go on, there are some more similarities of this kind, and that's not what I'm going for. I'm going for something else, and here it is. when one sees the work of Steiner, the initiate, Steiner, the master, the teacher of anthroposophy, one finds very clearly a Platonic gesture. This kind of elenchus and chorismos is embedded in the way in which Steiner is speaking. And I want to claim that he is very, very consciously doing that. Steiner is very aware of how it is that our consciousness in our present day and age is constituted, what makes our materialistic conception of the world possible, how it is that the infrastructure of concepts that make up our experience of the world as it is typical today for us, this structure is very clear to Steiner. And he wants to shake that very purposefully. So he devises a way of speaking aimed at that. So he's trying to make us conscious that the way that we experience the world is just the physical world, that there is a world behind, that there is a higher world, that there is a separated world, and we have to inwardly find the desire to go into the path of initiation. The desire to go through the path of initiation is intrinsically related to becoming conscious of the futility of our normal consciousness. And it is not a separate thing. So Steiner uses a kind of a pedagogical Platonism. In the best sense of the word pedagogical. I don't mean that he's tricking us. I don't mean that he's strategically using language that he doesn't mean. He means it very, very seriously. But I believe that his attempt here is pedagogical in the sense that he is attempting to awaken an inner path of the soul of the reader or the listener, in the case of his lectures. The spiritual world is behind. This is just Maya. How to attain knowledge of the higher worlds. So, becoming aware that there is such a thing as a threshold. A threshold. So now the threshold is something that we conceive of as being intrinsic part of our consciousness, whereas before, without the Platonic, let's say, pedagogical gesture, we wouldn't be aware of that. So Steiner is attempting to create a kind of dualistic consciousness. It's an orientation that splits the world. An orientation, once you acquire this dualistic consciousness, you attempt to leave it behind. So it's an orientation into the spiritual world. And the orientation says there is this side of the threshold of materialism in my own consciousness, and there is a higher form of consciousness beyond that I'm going towards. Yeah. This is what I claim is the pedagogical Platonism in anthroposophy. But that is not all that anthroposophy tells us. Anthroposophy also tells us that the spirit is right here. In a way, once the consciousness is there, Steiner attempts to bring the consciousness back, a regressum, a return into the place from which we began. But now the place that we arrive to is not the physical world in which we were entranced in the beginning. Now this world is, from the other side, the very activity of spiritual beings. The plant is not more just a plant subject to material and natural forces, but the natural forces themselves are just an external expression of an inward spiritual activity. In Theosophy, he says, I quote, "The soul and spirit worlds are not to be thought of as being alongside or outside the physical world. They are not separated in space from it. Just as for persons born blind and operated upon, the previously dark world flashes out in light and colors, so do things that previously were only corporeal phenomena reveal their soul and spirit qualities to anyone who is awakened in soul and spirit. It is true, moreover, that this world then becomes filled with other occurrences and beings that remain completely unknown to those whose soul and spirit senses are unawakened. So all those higher worlds and all those behinds are right here, but we do not have access to them because the consciousness in which we live is bound, as he says, to the sensory, but more importantly, to our conceptions that hold it in a certain way. And so in this way, just like Aristotle does away with the chorismos of Plato, anthroposophy first imbues the necessary Platonic chorismos in the soul, and then also gives us a way back right here. The attempt is to spiritualize entirely our consciousness of the natural world, of ourselves, of our relations to each other. And in that way, anthroposophy truly is a path of knowledge that leads from the spiritual in the human being to the spiritual in the cosmos. Thank you.